They didn't come at you with chaos. No, their tactics were polished, strategic, clean. Like a signature on an empty contract, their deception wore elegance like armor. It didn't scream danger, it whispered opportunity. And while the world saw coincidences or bad timing, you felt it in your bones. None of this was random. Behind the smiles and scripted conversations were calculations, precision-guided efforts to unmake what they never could understand. But when the blueprint of your soul was drawn by divine ink, every counterfeit plan crumbles under real pressure. They charted every move you might make, documented your instincts, archived your heartbreaks like they were studying a specimen instead of witnessing a prophecy in motion. But the one thing they never accounted for was this: sacred purpose doesn't play by earthly rules. What they saw as flaws were actually codes they couldn't crack, compassion mistaken for weakness, silence mistaken for surrender. They mistook your stillness for softness. They thought their manipulation was invisible, but the universe marked their schemes long before they ever launched them. They rehearsed your collapse like a script, hoping you'd follow the cues. But you weren't cast in their drama. You were being prepared for a role too big for their imagination. While they celebrated their setup, heaven prepared your comeback. The beauty of divine orchestration is that even the traps laid by enemies can become part of the path. What they designed to destroy you now documents their own undoing. Every strategic insult, every rehearsed betrayal, every alliance built behind your back is now evidence in your testimony. And now, under the weight of divine timing, the elegance of their deception is collapsing. Not because you fought back with vengeance, but because you didn't have to. You weren't designed to retaliate. You were created to outlast. This wasn't survival. This was sacred exposure. Their plans didn't fail because you were lucky. They failed because they underestimated what happens when a chosen one walks through fire and comes out with the flames still in their eyes. They weren't watching you to understand you, they were dissecting you, hoping to predict your next collapse. What looked like friendship was often just data collection dressed in warmth. They noted your pauses in conversation, the tremble behind your calm, the way you smiled even when you should have walked away. They didn't see empathy, they saw an opening. While you were building bonds, they were tracing the blueprint of your reactions, trying to find the sequence of triggers that would unlock your breakdown. In quiet meetings and surface-level exchanges, they gathered intelligence like collectors gathering rare coins, not for appreciation, but for manipulation. They observed which moments cracked your voice, which topics made your gaze drop, which memories turned your silence into surrender. You were never just a person to them. You were a project, a pattern to be exploited, a timeline to be interrupted. But their analysis was deeply flawed. The model they were using no longer applied. They assumed you were still living in that earlier version of yourself, the one that twisted into knots to avoid disappointing others, the one that feared solitude more than betrayal, the one that confused endurance with worth. They thought they'd cornered the same soul. But you had outgrown the mask they were trying to control. What had changed wasn't loud or visible. It wasn't posted or announced. The most powerful parts of your evolution took place in silence, in those hidden hours where no one was watching, when you chose alignment over approval and rebuilt your core with divine instruction. They never noticed the shift because it didn't come with noise. And yet, the atmosphere noticed first. Before your voice even changed, the frequency of your energy did. The smiles around you started feeling hollow. Invitations felt suspicious. The tone of once familiar voices grew sharp around the edges. There was something unnatural in the rhythm of the conversations, like they were rehearsing lines instead of speaking from truth. Compliments began landing sideways, coated in implications, seasoned with jealousy, dressed as encouragement but laced with warning. On the surface, nothing seemed hostile. But underneath, you could feel the sensors blinking red. You couldn't name it yet, but your spirit knew. What once felt like home now smelled like surveillance. They believed kindness was naivety. That your gentleness meant you lacked insight. They thought the patience in your responses came from fear, not discernment. What they missed was that every time they thought you were ignoring their shade, you were in fact recording their pattern, noting the rhythm of their deception like a composer listening for false notes in a symphony. While they executed rehearsed charm like stage actors in a play, you were studying the shadows in their delivery. You caught the way their tone shifted when truth approached. You tracked how their gaze flickered when they were hiding something. Their actions were visible, but their vibrations were screaming. And that's what you were tuned into. Not the language of words, but the frequency beneath them. Modern language may call it observation, but what moved through you was something deeper than science. It wasn't just empathy, it was spiritual calibration. A finely tuned inner compass that could detect turbulence beneath calm waters. While they measured manipulation by logic, you decoded it by essence. You didn't react because you were blind, you waited because you were building the full picture. They were gambling on who you used to be. Betting that the old triggers would still open the same doors. They tried to spark the grief that once made you lose yourself. They reached for past wounds like old keys, hoping one still fit. But none of their attempts registered. The locks had been changed in your absence. Their knowledge stopped at the surface. They understood the scars but never honored the recovery. They had diagrams of your trauma, but no map of your transcendence. They knew how you used to ache, but they never studied what happens when pain teaches you how to rise. You had upgraded silently, without their notice. And now their scripts read like ancient myths against the clarity of who you've become. What unnerved them most wasn't your strength, it was that they couldn't track how you got it. Your process was invisible. Your empowerment had no footsteps. While they gathered evidence from what you posted or said, your real evolution occurred in divine isolation, where no eyes could distort it. The systems they trusted, manipulation, emotional leverage, staged loyalty, were useless in a realm built on inner truth. By the time they launched their plan, you were already on another wavelength. They showed up to battle a version of you that no longer existed. Their weapons missed not because you hid, but because you no longer stood in the same place. You had become unreadable, untriggerable, unreachable, not by hiding, but by ascending. Every tactic they used, every tone they shifted, every sudden pause in their words became part of a growing archive inside your spirit. They believed they were guiding the performance, unaware that you had already learned the rhythm of their act. The more elaborate the lie, the more it revealed about their internal wiring. You weren't resisting the trap because you didn't see it, you were letting it finish building itself before stepping completely out of its reach. Soon, you began to sense coordination beyond coincidence. Individuals you once trusted began echoing each other in tone and suspicion, like rehearsing a script written by someone they'd never met. Neutral spaces grew tense without cause. Details you had shared in private began circulating in places they didn't belong. It stopped being interpersonal. This was no longer a wound, it was a strategy, and you were the target of something larger than gossip. Yet while they played invisible lines and group chats, another intelligence moved unseen. Information you couldn't possibly know began surfacing at just the right time. Names fell into your spirit without warning. Encounters with strangers confirmed suspicions you hadn't voiced. You would wake up with clarity you didn't go to sleep with. What they tried to hide was being revealed faster than they could update their lies. The trap wasn't made from rope or bars, it was constructed from emotion. They didn't try to break you outright. They tried to wrap themselves in false loyalty, manufacturing distress so they could arrive as the rescuer. They created situations meant to wear you down, then offered solutions that disguised their fingerprints. Their plan was not just to hurt, it was to be needed while hurting you. They designed you to spiral. That was the point. To isolate you with contradictions. To present compliments with just enough edge to confuse. To sabotage your confidence, then blame your overthinking. Their brilliance was in the circular logic. If you resisted, you were ungrateful. If you submitted, they grew bolder. The whole architecture depended on you doubting yourself. What they failed to realize was that your patience wasn't passivity, it was observation. You weren't reacting because you were afraid. You were gathering proof, reading body language like scripture, noticing the language people used when they thought they were being subtle. While they relied on camouflage, you had mastered pattern recognition. Every interaction was a lesson. Every betrayal became a glossary term in your spiritual dictionary. And now, they're shocked that you're 10 steps ahead. But how could you not be? They taught you their style without knowing it. In trying to manipulate you, they made you fluent in their language. In trying to confuse you, they made you disciplined in clarity. They exposed themselves by thinking you weren't paying attention, but attention was the only thing you never stopped giving. When pressure began building around you, they expected instinctive defense or public outcry. But you did neither. You chose stillness with surgical intent. Not out of fear, but out of alignment. They believed they were drawing you in, tightening control, but you were watching from higher ground, letting the pattern form fully before responding. Their mistake was thinking your pause meant paralysis, not precision. What they failed to sense was that every step they took was being recorded in your discernment. You tracked tone shifts, directional changes in loyalty, and the rhythm of their coordination like reading code. They assumed they were in motion while you were static, but you had become a mirror, reflecting nothing, revealing everything. The moment you moved, it wasn't loud or erratic. It was final. They had orchestrated a delicate illusion, but you didn't need to shout to collapse it. You waited until the architecture of the scheme became so obvious that it turned in on itself. Then, with one calibrated shift, an act so simple yet intentional, the entire structure buckled. You didn't force exposure. You made it inevitable. While they relied on emotional bait, you stood in absolute clarity. Their models of manipulation were built on outdated memories. They designed triggers based on your former operating system. But the code had changed. The buttons they once pressed with ease now led to nothing. What once hurt had become hollow. What once confused had become transparent. They brought old tools to dismantle a fortress that no longer used the same locks. Every tactic they recycled had once worked on the you that bled quietly in the dark. But you weren't walking wounded anymore. You had evolved in solitude, rewritten from essence, not reaction. They tried psychological tricks, not realizing your mind had been rebuilt with new architecture, one they couldn't map or influence. The resilience they mistook as fragility had become embedded intuition. The very wounds they had counted on became sensors, alerting you to deception before it fully formed. What they meant to use as pressure points now served as radar. You weren't just stronger, you were untouchable because they never learned the language of who you've become. They played a human game, expecting a human response. But you weren't functioning from instinct, you were moving from instruction. The moment you acted, it wasn't revenge. It was revelation. And that's why it was unstoppable. You weren't confused by their behavior, you were just silently confirming what your intuition already suspected. The charm felt mechanical. The confessions arrived on cue. Their tone carried the same choreography as someone following invisible stage directions. They were so invested in convincing you of their sincerity, unaware you had already seen beyond the curtain. Every act they thought was clever felt recycled, uninspired, and transparent. It would have been easy to call it out in the moment, to disrupt the show and confront the mask directly. But you knew better. You understood that truth doesn't need to shout to be effective, it only needs to wait. If you moved too soon, they'd shift their angle, swap costumes, and launch the same routine under a different disguise. But if you waited, if you allowed the full scene to unfold, they'd eventually run out of scripts and reveal the original author of the deception. So you let the storyline play out, knowing the ending couldn't be rewritten once it was complete. You didn't stay quiet because you were unsure. You stayed quiet because the last lie hadn't been spoken yet. You could feel it, How every manipulation required one more layer, one more witness, one more slip in their narrative. You held your posture not for them, but for the timeline of accountability that was already in motion. You kept your words measured and your movements minimal, not to keep peace, but to build a case. You were never passive. You were collecting timestamps. Every contradiction was mentally cataloged. Every shift in tone was a breadcrumb. You weren't being pulled into anything. You were writing the report while they thought you were falling for the bait. They believed they were building a trap. What they didn't realize was that they were recording their confession with every move they made. Had you interrupted midway, they would have played innocent. They would have raised their voice first, changed the subject faster, painted you as irrational. You'd be the one under scrutiny while they stood untouchable in the glow of false innocence. But by letting them finish, you let their pattern testify against them. And that's what made the trap collapse, not accusation, but exposure by design. The greatest evidence wasn't in what you said, it was in what you withheld. You allowed the narrative to entangle itself without interference. You let them think they were gaining ground, unaware that you were removing the oxygen from their performance in silence. By the time it ended, they had written every line of their own undoing. All you had to do was remember. And now, as the dust settles, you're not emerging as the survivor of their plan, but as the witness of its failure. You didn't rush the ending. You didn't skip steps. You let the performance finish so the story could never be rewritten. And in that, you didn't just walk away with peace. You walked away with proof. You had been cataloging inconsistencies like a forensic analyst, collecting details with the quiet focus of someone who wasn't just watching, but waiting. While they believed they were surrounding you, they were unknowingly building a stage they'd have to perform their own downfall on. Their tactics grew bolder, their risk appetite increased, and their movements became more frantic. They mistook your non-response for confusion. They didn't realize you were letting gravity do its job. The atmosphere began to respond before anyone else did. Invisible shifts signaled something was recalibrating. What was once hidden began surfacing without effort. You didn't summon support, it appeared. Doors opened without knocking. Connections emerged like clockwork. While they calculated your collapse, a different equation was playing out around you. One you didn't orchestrate, but were always meant to walk into. Their final move was meant to finish you, not shake you. They thought their final orchestration would erase your credibility, humiliate you beyond recovery, and scatter your inner strength. But what they didn't account for was that you had already survived worse. The blow they crafted as fatal became the announcement of their desperation. It wasn't your silence that broke, it was their illusion of control. They expected the same old response: retreat, apology, self-blame. What they didn't expect was that you had already deleted the version of you who used to protect people from their own consequences. They counted on your compassion to carry their weight. They didn't notice that your endurance was no longer for sale. Their hope was that you'd rather suffer than confront, and they built their timing around that belief. But the illusion cracked when you stopped carrying burdens you never asked for. You stopped keeping quiet about violations they insisted were misunderstandings. The moment you realized silence wasn't peace, it was a cage, something shifted. What they called staying above drama was actually you being spiritually held hostage. But that contract expired. And you never renewed it. You began to see your loyalty not as a virtue, but as a weapon they had customized to fit their grip. And once you reclaimed it, they lost access. No more emotional blackmail. No more reputation insurance through your kindness. the script flipped. You didn't burn bridges, you simply stopped letting them cross. And in that choice, heaven didn't just back you, it lifted you. What unraveled them wasn't an argument or an accusation, it was that subtle shift in your presence. Not a forced smile or a performative grin, but the kind of expression that only someone holding deep inner certainty can carry. That look on your face said the decision had already been made. It told them, without words, that their entire scheme was operating under expired assumptions. Their confidence deflated because they suddenly realized they were performing for someone who wasn't buying the act. They came hungry for reaction. They crafted scenes hoping you'd explode, spin out, or fold under pressure. They used ridicule disguised as jokes, sarcasm soaked in jealousy, and carefully placed insults designed to trigger your past pain. But you didn't give them a script to twist. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't flinch. What they saw instead was unnerving stillness, the kind of self-possession that reveals how little power they actually had. The chaos they designed to trap you collapsed without participation. You didn't need to pull off their masks. You simply held the space long enough for their own imbalance to reveal itself. Their gestures grew exaggerated. Their inconsistencies mounted. The personas they tried to maintain began to crack under the weight of your discernment. One by one, the illusions they crafted began to dissolve, not because you fought them, but because the contrast between your peace and their panic became impossible to ignore. Your silence wasn't emptiness, it was force. It became the spotlight they couldn't escape. While they scrambled to control outcomes, you let the truth rise without pushing. Everything they had tried to bury began to float. Witnesses they thought they had secured started questioning their loyalties. The very energy they directed to destroy you became a reflection of their own unraveling. Their carefully coordinated attack fractured under its own weight. Every time they launched a new assault, something stronger met it on your behalf. You didn't retaliate, you transcended. Resources arrived out of nowhere. Conversations shifted in your favor. They couldn't understand how you were standing, much less thriving. But you knew. You weren't operating alone. Your alignment wasn't just personal, it was strategic, cosmic. What they mistook as luck was the evidence of protection they never accounted for. Their misfires became your training. Every insult sharpened your insight. Every setup taught you a new spiritual pattern. They gave you material for your evolution, thinking it would be your undoing. And without meaning to, they made you dangerous in a new way, wise. What was supposed to humiliate you turned into your most advanced lesson in spiritual pattern recognition. What was supposed to silence you gave you language others now need to hear. And then, the final unveiling, this wasn't just about flawed people making poor choices. You started to see the pattern replicated in others. You began to sense the deeper intelligence behind the timing, the coordination, the eerie familiarity of the strategies. You weren't fighting random enemies. You were witnessing a deeper system trying to halt divine momentum. But by standing still, you made the invisible visible, and nothing stays hidden once it's named. While most would have been consumed by confusion or emotional collapse, you were focused on decoding the coordination behind the chaos. You could tell that many weren't acting from free will. Something deeper had infiltrated their decisions, generational scripts, unconscious contracts, unresolved lineages of pain moving through them like invisible strings. It explained the accuracy of the attacks, the familiarity of the patterns, the haunting precision of betrayal that seemed too intentional to be coincidence. The shift came when you stopped wrestling with the individual pieces and stepped back to examine the entire design. You quit chasing down apologies and started tracking the origin of the assignment. And suddenly, the stage lights hit the puppeteers. You could see it all, the emotional engineers, the patterns of influence, the energies whispering through flesh and ego. This wasn't just conflict. This was infiltration wearing a human face. That's when you stopped defending and started commanding. You withdrew your energy from people who weren't yours to rehabilitate. You stopped interceding for those who had no intention of healing. Your prayers became tactical. Your discernment sharpened like a blade. You weren't angry, you were awake. What they called chaos, you saw as revelation. You realized your presence was never accidental. You weren't the target. You were the trap. Not for your destruction, but for their exposure. The setup wasn't meant to crush you, it was meant to give you access to blueprints hidden beneath polite society. Every whisper, every shift in posture, every forced smile became a clue. While they rehearsed betrayal, you were collecting raw data. You weren't caught in the middle, you were planted in the center for a reason. The plot wasn't about pain. It was about visibility. You had the strength to perceive what others would have dismissed. You were never placed there to fall. You were stationed there to observe, to trace the wiring, to identify which masks belonged to which alliances. And once the structure was mapped, you became living proof that it all existed. Not for petty vindication, but because your clarity would become someone else's survival guide. You carried the full diagram, not to destroy, but to teach. The residue of betrayal didn't stain you, it activated something ancient inside you. You didn't need revenge. You became the contradiction. Your stillness disoriented their strategy. Your growth embarrassed their projections. They couldn't understand how everything they weaponized became tools in your expansion. Projects they tried to kill flourished without explanation. Allies they tried to sever returned stronger than before. What they meant to bury became seed. And now, you're walking through rooms as the evidence. Not holding paperwork, being the record. Your endurance, your clarity, your radiance in the aftermath, it became the quiet exposure they never anticipated. And others started noticing. Their stories began to unravel too. The narrative they once controlled is now slipping, and the ripple effect didn't stop with you, it multiplied.